Try to imagine running a business with no legal contracts, no court you can sue in when a partner steals from you, no insurance when a shipment disappears. Your employees can be arrested or killed on any given week. You can't advertise, you can't hire through normal channels, and every single transaction has to happen in cash, off the books, with people you can never be entirely sure aren't working for the people trying to shut you down. Now imagine that business generating more annual revenue than Netflix, more than Nike. Some estimates put the biggest drug trafficking organizations in the world in the same revenue tier as Fortune 500 companies, built on a product that costs pennies to grow and sells for hundreds of times that by the time it reaches a customer. How does an organization with none of the protections a normal business relies on end up that profitable? Because for a long time, I assumed the answer was just violence and fear, that cartels win through brutality, full stop. And that's part of the story, but it's actually the smaller part. The bigger part is something a lot more uncomfortable to sit with. Cartels are, in a cold and clinical sense, exceptionally well-run businesses. They understand incentives, pricing, and risk better than most MBA graduates. And once you see the actual mechanics, you start noticing the same principles at work in industries that are completely legal. Here's where most people get the story wrong. We tend to imagine organized crime as chaotic. Guys with guns, cash and duffel bags, no real structure behind it. That image is comforting in a way, because it lets us file the whole thing under different world, doesn't apply to me. But economists who've actually studied these organizations closely, including researchers who embedded with cartel accountants and mid-level operators for books like Narconomics, found something different. They found spreadsheets, quality control, regional managers, HR-style onboarding for new members. In some organizations, there were literal severance packages for members who wanted to leave peacefully. That's not the aesthetic Hollywood sells you, and it's genuinely disorienting the first time you learn it, because it means the billions aren't a byproduct of chaos, they're a byproduct of discipline applied to a very specific set of economic conditions. And those conditions are worth understanding, because they're not unique to drugs, they just happen to be most visible there.
Let's start with the part that actually explains most of the money. The price of illegal goods has almost nothing to do with what it costs to produce them. A kilogram of raw coca leaf, processed into cocaine at the source, might cost a producer somewhere in the range of a couple $1,000s to bring to a semi-finished state. By the time that same kilogram, cut and distributed, reaches a street-level buyer in a wealthy country, it can be worth well over $100,000. That markup isn't material cost. It isn't even mostly profit margin in the way we normally think about margin. Economists call it a risk premium, and it's worth sitting with what that phrase actually means. Every single person who touches that product along the way, from the smuggler to the distributor to the local dealer, is being paid primarily for absorbing risk. Risk of arrest, risk of seizure, risk of violence from rivals, risk of losing everything overnight with no legal recourse to recover it. Prohibition doesn't eliminate a market, it just moves the cost of illegality directly into the price tag, and someone downstream always pays it. This is actually the same principle, just dialed up to an extreme, behind why anything scarce or risky costs more than its raw materials suggest. A diamond isn't priced at what it costs to mine. Concert tickets from a scalper aren't priced at face value. In every case, part of what you're paying for isn't the object, it's someone else's tolerance for risk, scarcity, or inconvenience, converted into a number. The second piece of the system is structural, and it's honestly the part that impressed economists the most. Cartels figured out how to scale without centralizing, which is exactly what makes them so hard to dismantle. Large trafficking organizations often don't operate as one unified company the way a corporation does. They function more like franchises, a central brand, a reputation, sometimes even a name that carries weight and fear on its own, licensed out to semi-independent cells that operate with real autonomy. If law enforcement takes down one cell, the organization doesn't collapse because that cell was never the whole business. It was a franchise location. A new one opens somewhere else, often within weeks, because the brand and the supply chain that actually generate value were never concentrated in one vulnerable place to begin with. If that structure sounds familiar, it's because it's the exact same logic behind how fast food chains, hotel brands, and franchise businesses scale in the legal economy. Decentralize the operational risk, protect the brand and the supply chain, and let local units absorb the exposure. Cartels didn't invent this, they just applied it to a product where the exposure happens to be prison instead of a bad Yelp review.
The third piece is the one that's hardest to talk about honestly, and it's violence, but not in the way it usually gets portrayed. In a legal economy, if someone breaks a business agreement, you have courts, you have contracts, judges, the ability to sue. None of that exists for an organization operating entirely outside the law. So violence, as grim as this is to say plainly, becomes the substitute for a legal system. It's how debts get enforced, how territory gets protected, how loyalty gets guaranteed when there's no paperwork backing any of it up. This is genuinely one of the most tragic parts of the whole system, and I don't want to gloss past it, because real people, often in communities that had little to do with creating the demand in the first place, absorb the human cost of that enforcement. Whatever fascination there is in the business mechanics, none of it erases that this is an industry built on real suffering in the countries where these organizations operate and in the communities affected by addiction on the other end of the supply chain. Understanding the system isn't the same as admiring it. And then there's the final piece, which is what happens after the money is made, converting an enormous pile of illegal cash into something that looks, on paper, completely ordinary. This is generally done by blending illicit money into legitimate cash-heavy businesses and assets, real estate, construction, retail, anything where large cash volumes don't immediately raise questions, until the money's origin becomes difficult to trace. It's a genuinely fascinating piece of financial engineering, and also one of the primary reasons global banking regulation exists in the form it does today. I'm going to leave it there at the concept level, because the actual mechanics are exactly the kind of detail that shouldn't be spelled out in a video like this. Here's the turning point, and it's the idea I actually want you to leave with. Once you understand that cartels succeed by mastering scarcity, risk pricing, decentralized exposure, and a brand reputation strong enough that people stop asking what they're actually paying for, you start noticing those exact same forces at work everywhere in the legal economy, just wearing nicer clothes. A company doesn't need a cartel's reputation for violence to command loyalty. It just needs enough emotional trust that customers stop comparison shopping. The uncomfortable realization is that a huge amount of what makes any business, legal or not, extremely profitable comes down to the same handful of psychological and economic levers: manufactured scarcity, controlled risk, decentralized exposure, a brand strong enough that people stop asking what they're actually paying for. Cartels just operate in the one context where those levers get pulled to their most extreme, most violent conclusion. But the underlying mechanics aren't exotic, they're just amplified. So what do you actually do with this, sitting at home, nowhere near any of this world? Mostly, it's about training yourself to ask a slightly different question when you're evaluating any price, any deal, any business that seems to be printing money out of nowhere. Instead of just asking what something costs, ask what risk, scarcity, or story is baked into that number. Sometimes that markup is legitimate, covering real quality or real scarcity, but sometimes it's manufactured, a limited drop that isn't actually limited, an urgency that isn't actually urgent, a brand premium standing in for a product that's fundamentally ordinary. It's also worth remembering the next time an opportunity looks too profitable for how simple it seems, that profit and risk are almost always linked somewhere in the chain, even when that risk isn't visible to you directly.
If a deal seems to break that relationship entirely, offering enormous return with apparently no risk anywhere in the picture, that's usually the moment to slow down rather than speed up. Because somewhere, that risk still exists. It just hasn't been priced in where you can see it yet. And more broadly, understanding how decentralized, brand-driven structures survive pressure, whether that's a franchise chain or a criminal network, gives you a clearer lens for understanding your own financial life, your own risk tolerance, and how much of what you pay for day to day is material versus story. I want to end this one honestly, because this isn't a topic with a tidy, comforting bow to tie on it. There's nothing admirable happening in the human cost of this industry, and understanding the mechanics behind the money was never meant to be mistaken for approval of it. If anything, seeing how deliberately engineered the whole system is makes the tragedy more visible, not less, because it reveals that none of this is inimitable chaos. It's the predictable result of specific incentives playing out exactly the way you'd expect once you understand what's actually being priced. But there's something worth taking from it anyway, and it's the same thing we keep coming back to. Systems, whether they're built in a casino, a checkout page, or something far darker, tend to work by exploiting predictable human patterns: scarcity, risk, trust, and urgency. The more clearly you can see those patterns at work in the world around you, the less power any of them have to quietly shape your decisions without your permission. You don't need to understand the underground economy to benefit from this. You just need to remember that almost everything with a price tag is telling you a story about risk and scarcity, whether that story is true or manufactured. Learning to ask which one you're looking at is a small habit, but over the lifetime of decisions, small habits like that add up to something that looks a lot like clarity.
If this kind of thing is useful to you, pulling apart the systems that quietly shape how money moves without the hype and without the fear-mongering, that's basically the whole point of this channel. I'm Business Decoded, and if you want more of this kind of thinking, subscribing helps more than you'd think. I'll see you in the next one.